Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and I'm sure, for today's session, then our guest, our audience, I'm sure they will be really happy because long time they ask me a lot of question about what is Mr. David Wood. So after a long time, Mr. David Wood joins in World Talent Economy Forum. So hopefully, our student, youth community, policymakers from different countries, they will be really happy to observe his presentation or his knowledge sharing sessions with World Talent Economy Forums. We have our another talented speakers, Mr. Lauren. He's a climate change activist, and he has a very good contributions from Canada. And I'm sure with the contributions of Mr. David Schumacher, he already contribute a lot for the youth communities, and every week he is supporting World Talent Economy Forums. So I want to give thanks to everyone for your continuous support. So I want to start from Mr. David Wood. What do you want to share about Net Zero Challenge? And beside that, what the new book you are writing, and what the new things you want to share with our audience?
So the importance of net zero cannot be underestimated. It's because the potential of unexpected change in the climate could be very significant indeed. Sometimes people imagine that the climate will only change in a linear way, that it will start off and it will slowly change and slowly change. It might go down, it might go up, might go down, might go up a little bit. But sometimes, climate can escalate. Sometimes if the overall environment reaches a particular tipping point, we might see many more instances of extreme weather. And it won't just be that some parts of the world are hotter. It will be that some parts of the world have a much more variable temperature. It's not just, to talk in terms of statistics, that the mean will be higher, but the variance will be higher. The variance will be higher over time, but the variance will also be higher around the world. So some parts of the world will experience greater drought. Other parts of the world may experience greater floods. Some parts of the world will indeed be hotter. Other parts, for a while, will be colder, as we are seeing just a few weeks ago in the southern US state of Texas, which was very proud. It was a very warm state, except due to changes in weather, probably linked to climate change, plunged it to be much colder than usual. So the risk is not just that we might, by the middle of the century, be on average 1 degree or 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees higher, is that we could be in a much more variable temperature. And these changes may conceivably happen much sooner than the end of the century. It could happen within a few decades, and we just don't know. So that's why this is such an important topic. And it's a bit like the pandemic. People predicted a pandemic long before it happened. Bill Gates tried to warn the world about a pandemic in a famous TEDx talk. And people said, yeah, maybe. But then they went on with life as usual and didn't pay enough attention to it. People are hearing in the same way about the possibility of extreme climate change. And then we say, maybe. And then we get back on with our normal lives. Actually, this should be seen as an existential threat. I don't mean that all human life might be wiped extinct, although that is a possibility too, as I'll mention in a moment. But there are certainly possibilities of much worse winds, rains, snow, and heat, which will make life unbearable, even if we try to adapt. And adaptation is an important part of it. I don't deny that. But we will not be able to adapt quickly enough to the changes that will come. I mentioned briefly there's a slight chance humanity might become extinct. Well, if we look back in the history of all of life, I'm not just talking about the history of human life. I'm talking about the history of all life on Earth. There have been 5 great extinctions. And the greatest of these 5 was when the dinosaurs started, not when they ended. It's on a particular geological boundary. And we can't be sure what caused each of these 5 great extinctions, but there is a strong theory that great extinction, which wiped out something like 80% of all living species at that time, was caused by a sudden increase in temperature. Now, it wasn't caused by mammals or whoever else emitting greenhouse gases at that time. It was other geological features, but it caused tipping points. It caused long buried greenhouse gases to be suddenly emitted into the atmosphere, causing a rapid change in temperature, causing many species unexpectedly to go extinct. Could such a thing happen in the future? There's probably a small probability, but we should not discount that small probability, just as we were foolish to discount the small probability of a pandemic. So that's why I'm very glad that this topic is being put on the agenda for today's meeting.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Laurent, a long time you are working for climate change activists and many interesting projects you have. So how do you want to analyze this point, net zero challenge?
Today I just rewatched a video from Bill Gates called "Innovating to Zero." It's from 11 years ago, and basically he said we need to have innovation in many different sectors in order to actually get net zero emissions. He mentioned nuclear as one option, as in addition to wind power and solar power. The advantage of nuclear is that it can create a tremendous amount of energy in a very small area. I think he said that it's when you compare nuclear power to coal power, it could take a million times less space. So there's still problems with cost in terms of nuclear, but Bill Gates was working on a project called TerraPower, and it could make less nuclear waste and make it more cost efficient. So that's one possibility. But also for just to say a few statistics, for the cost of crystalline silicon solar cell modules. So for solar power, in 1976 it used to be almost $80 per watt, and now it's about 20 cents per watt. So the price of solar panels went down a lot, and the use of solar panels increased dramatically. It's like an exponential curve. So there's a lot of hope now in both wind power and solar power. So I think nuclear is still an important option. A famous climate scientist, James Hansen from NASA, he said that we need to have nuclear as well. But it's important to mention that the price of solar panels and wind turbines are going down a lot, and their use is exploding. So we need to continue to invest in solar and wind power. I think we need to invest in many different solutions simultaneously. And basically, for solar power, basically, there's another statistics. There's enough solar energy that reaches the planet every hour to fill all the world's energy needs for a full year. So just solar power could do a tremendous amount of good. However, and for both wind power and solar power, we need more battery storage. We need to have more efficient batteries to actually store the intermittency, the power, because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So you need batteries to store the energy. Unfortunately, there's an increase in the storage capability of batteries, and we need to continue to invest in more battery storage. So I think to get net zero, we need to do a combination of many things. Continue to invest in battery storage, invest solar and wind, invest in nuclear, but there's also other sources of energy as well: geothermal, tidal power, wave power, and so on, and hydroelectricity as well. So we need to invest in many different things. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor David Schumacher, how do you want to analyze this point, net zero challenges?
Yes, good morning. Well, I'm going to share my screen here. And then we'll talk through a couple of slides. There we go.
Yes.
Okay, so net zero by 2050. So I think it's important to put a date on this, and that's what the Net Zero Challenge has done. And there's, as I read it at the World Economic Forum, where you can go read it too, weforum.org, net zero by 2050 or sooner. So that puts a sense of time-bound energy on this idea. Now, as many of the viewers know, I come at many of these subjects from a political background, and this one would be no different. I think that political policy is an important thing to be able to motivate, certainly the people that we go vote, who we vote for, and it can have side benefits as well. But I really think this is something that we as citizens, wherever we're at, can do, is to try to influence those that have political power and support those that have more of a view of working to meet these challenges, and we can support them as well. That's something that we can directly do. But where are we at today? I found this chart as I was looking around. This was also at the World Economic Forum, and they were showing nations, sub-nations that have committed to zero carbon by 2050. Now this slide, fortunately, we're doing a little bit better than what the slide has. As you look at the United States, the state of Arizona, where I'm at, is recently flipped that tile chart to blue, and in January they have made a dedication to make public energy systems carbon neutral by 2050. But you can see that a big part of the world has not, at least formally, adopted something of this nature. You know, what are some of the things that are behind that? As we look at developed and developing countries, if you can read this chart, the highlighted area has to do with environment or climate change and how it rates as far as priorities for the nations. My nation, it does not rate in the top 5. Germany, higher, and we see that it's not on the chart at all in a developing nation like Turkey. So there is plenty of work to be done worldwide supporting the agenda. And supporting the agenda so far, what I've been talking about is limiting and reducing the problem. And, come on, slide. And we have to talk about, I think, what happens if we don't limit the problem. What happens to us? That's why we need the urgency of the date, 2050. We need the urgency in trying to raise the awareness in our governments and in our businesses. But if we don't, maybe we need a plan B. So what's a plan B look like? Here in my country, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has been given the go-ahead to study 2 geoengineering proposals that say that if we cannot reduce the effects of carbon gases by that date, then what are other things that we can do? And they're looking at sulfur dioxide, they're looking at sea salts, particles. These are meant to create shade. Now, Plan B, everyone wants Plan A. And Plan B is not as desirable. I think many people would agree with that, but I think it's good to have a Plan B. 2050. 2050 is an interesting date. In 2050, I will just be getting into 3 digits age-wise. And I have a plan of attack to get me there and beyond. But in case I'm not able to carry that out, I too have a Plan B. And one of the things on my bio is that I'm a cryonicist. And that can be a topic for another time if you're not aware of it. But let me just say that that is a plan to continue on if I cannot make my Plan A work. So we do need to look into Plan Bs, either at the government level, or what I really propose is an idea called environmental entrepreneurship. And this can be used for both our Plan A, reducing carbon emissions, alternative energies. It can also be used for developing better Plan Bs and having a biggest approach possible at looking at trying to mitigate the situation that we have before us in just a few decades. People being people, we can many times encourage them more with a carrot than we can with something that they interpret as a stick. So as I talk to people about reducing their carbon footprint, that comes across as a bit of a negative. But if I talk to them about growing their business, about growing opportunity, they can become much more excited about that. Inc.com, Inc. magazine, looks at climate change as a potential $26 trillion growth industry. If we can turn business leaders and focus them in that direction, if we can look at what that means to taxation for governments and focus them in that direction, then we're leading with a carrot towards being able to do the two things that we want to do. Some businesses are already going in that direction, and here's a list of a few. Alternative fuels for the airline industry, for example. Tesla with its electric vehicles. The company Impossible with its plant-based meats, if you will. And the list goes on and on. But we don't have to just leave that to the big corporations. I think individuals, small companies can also be environmental entrepreneurs. And we can use this to do good as we move forward. We've seen positive effects on the environment from the lockdowns during COVID-19. Some of them were fairly dramatic early on when the lockdowns were very solid. We can take what we've learned from that and expand on that greatly, look for innovative solutions, both to reducing carbon, but also look to innovative Plan B options as well. It is possible to make money and to do good works at the same time. But let's not forget what citizens can do applying political pressure in government, and let's not forget what we can do applying pressure in the marketplace as well. Vote at the ballot box as you can. Vote with your money as you can to support this change in the direction that we want to go. And let's get to net zero by 2050. Thank you.
Excellent, Mr. David Schumacher. Because I'm sure that our audience gets some idea that how this net zero challenge and this kind of strategy will be implemented in futures. Mr. David Wood, like as we are thinking that we need to produce more entrepreneurs for solving this problem, climate change related problems. So what area this entrepreneur should focus, even though we are observing from developed nations, they have many like innovative way to produce different entrepreneurs. But what your advice, especially country like Malaysia, Singapore, or example India and this kind of country, Indonesia, how they can produce more entrepreneur who can solve this climate change related issue specifically. I think this reason they will be highly affected for climate change.
There are kind of three bits of advice. The first is for individual entrepreneurs, and the second two are for governments. And it's true, individual entrepreneurs can make a great difference. What Laurent said is correct. The progress in reducing the cost of solar energy is remarkable. And it's been done by clever entrepreneurs thinking up apparently crazy ideas, and many of them failing, but enough of them succeeding. And there's been similar steps forwards in the cost and quality of wind energy. And there are other possibles like geothermal too, which is very significant in some countries, such as Iceland, for example. So there's a lot that entrepreneurs can do, and we could talk a bit more about that. But I don't want to let governments off the hook. And in fact, I think governments have the most important role here. And that's because we need to level the playing field. Currently, the fossil fuels industries has in effect a great subsidy. They are not paying an appropriate penalty for all the pollution which is being emitted from their products. As a result of that, the costs of fossil fuel energy are too low by some long way. And we need governments around the world to get involved in agreeing and applying carbon taxes. Just as we don't allow companies to emit lead pollution, we used to. America, Western world, used to have petrol with lead in it, which was quite convenient until people noticed it was actually damaging children's health. It was actually lowering the IQs of children around the world. And although the petrol companies, the car industry objected, eventually there were rules put in place which caused the petrol industry to be more innovative and introduce non-leaded alternatives. So I think governments have got to help entrepreneurs here. Many possible good businesses developing aspects of carbon storage, for example, is another line to look at. They are insufficiently financially viable in the short term because the competition, the existing fossil fuel industries, are getting things far too easy. So the most important advice is to governments. And what does that come back to entrepreneurs? All of us need better skills in politics. That's one of my abiding messages. If we want to survive in the future, the skill all of us need is better politics. We need to be able to influence the decision of political parties and political leaders so that they make the appropriate large public changes that we as individuals can't do. So my strong advice is for entrepreneurs, activists, students, campaigners of all sorts, to put more pressure on governments to put proper prices on the pollutions of greenhouse gases and all the other industries, by the way, which are also responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just burning of fossil fuels, it's the cement industry, it's the steel industry, it's agriculture. Collectively, they add a great deal too, which is one thing that Bill Gates' new book explores in a very interesting way. So there's lots of steps the government should take to put prices on things. And my last advice is that these governments also need to provide more financial support and financial incentives for entrepreneurs in this area. Entrepreneurs who are looking at novel ways of doing solar energy, novel ways of doing wind energy. There's lots of places where there's lots of wind blowing onshore and offshore that could be tapped more aggressively. And as Lauren also mentioned, improvements in energy storage, so that when there is a surplus of renewable energy briefly, that energy can be stored and then used when there is a deficit because the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing. This needs better batteries, or there are lots of alternative ideas for how energy might be stored, even including hydroelectric. That is, you use surplus electricity to pump water up a slope, and then when you need to get it back again, you let the water flow down the slope again. You lose a lot of efficiency like that, so it's not great, but it's still better than other solutions. And people are looking at many other ways in which energy might be stored, perhaps on a flywheel, a huge, massive flywheel, which you can speed up. So that's another angle there at which entrepreneurs could get involved.
Thank you. Thank you. We have our new friends, new speakers. Mr. Alex, how are you, Mr. Alex? How do you want to analyze this point, net zero challenges?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Everyone can hear me okay? Broadcasting live from Santa Cruz, California. It's pretty early here, but so I've studied renewable energy and resources, solar technology, and I'm happy to say that I've been able to take the lead. Well, it was a course in green building construction and design. It was on LEED certifications on different materials, different green building materials, recycled materials, and efficiency of buildings. So there's different, if we break it down into categories, we could talk about making a home really efficient. We could talk about making businesses efficient, commercial businesses, governmental businesses, and different applications that we can put efficiency or net zero carbon emissions. There's also the term not just regarding like a home, a net energy home, or a net energy building. There's also talking about like a net energy country. I mean, where the whole country has basically net energy emissions or net zero emissions. So I know there's a wide range of different ways that we can lower the environmental impact and the carbon emissions of a home and a business. So we could break that down into a lot of different categories and subcategories. So one of the most important things I think is like for us to extract materials sustainably, because we do live on a planet of finite resources. So any way that we can extract resources and then replenish them at the same time. One of those ways that I like to support is the Forest Stewardship Council certified lumber. It stands for it's a FSC certified lumber. So they make sure that they're planting new forests and they're harvesting lumber sustainably. Another way that they look at the efficiency of a building or a business or office is based off the appliances. So there's like some appliances should be Energy Star, energy efficient. They look at making sure that there's low flow fixtures on all the sinks, on all the faucets, on the showers, all of that. They make sure that everything is insulated really well, that they have good insulation on the walls and also in the ceiling. They make sure that there's a lot of non-toxic zero VOC paint, that they're not using a lot of chemicals. Most LEED certified buildings and anything that's net zero emissions also incorporates renewable energy or resources in some way. So there's having a building efficient and then also having the energy sustainable. So both of those aspects are very important. And when you're talking about net zero energy emissions, there's the application of having an existing building and you're retrofitting all these different aspects of that building to get it more efficient, or when you're building a new building and you're starting from scratch and you have a lot more room to design it a certain way. And we're now creating net zero cities around the world. I mean, there's some really cool videos that Dubai has been doing where they're starting from scratch. It's like a clean slate. They buy a big parcel of land and they're designing it in the most efficient way, and they're doing a lot of really cool things with reclaiming water, rainwater catchment, incorporating solar, growing their own food, with the way the walkways are, everything that they're doing. And we need to continue to transition towards not even net zero, just all of us have to collectively lower our environmental impact and our carbon footprint. And any countries, buildings, corporations, or individuals that are striving towards net zero emissions is very appreciated and honorable. I mean, it's the only way. I mean, we're destroying Earth way beyond its ability to recharge and replenish. So I'm happy that we're having this conversation. I'll go ahead and leave the rest of the time back to the panel.
Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. Yes.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, interesting conversation. Still thinking more about the intersection between politics, policy, activism. We have some examples. David Wood mentioned about lead in fuels, and that got me thinking about automobile safety. I remember a time when there were no seatbelts, there were no airbags, there was no consciousness at all, really, among safety. Highway deaths were something that happened, and that was tragic. But when that did get into the consciousness, when there was legislation for seatbelts and safety devices, and then comparing vehicles, which vehicle was safer than another vehicle. And there were citizen organizations that sprung up, independent groups, as well as government, to measure the effectiveness of safety devices. That got into the consciousness of the people, to the point where we went from being unconscious about automobile safety to where you would see in automobile advertisements, my vehicle rates as one of the top 10, one of the top 5, maybe number 1 in its class in safety. The whole argument was completely turned around. That sort of thing can also be very valuable in what we're talking about CO2 emissions, what we're talking about our carbon footprint, what we're talking about as we move forward. It can become an advantage, an incentive, but it takes spreading that word. And I agree with David that it does take having the government involved in a way that makes people look at this and see what they can do with this, and hopefully then bring us back to this entrepreneurial spirit where we can have an effective public and private partnership with a goal of actually moving in that direction. I live in the state of Arizona, and the sun shines here every day, just about. I mean, we get an abundance, but it's only been recently that I've really seen solar energy take off in this state. There is a momentum. The laws of momentum, I think, apply in psychology as well as they do in the physical world. And it takes a bit of time to be able to convert your thinking from here's how we have always done things to how we are going to do them in the future, going back to that automobile safety example. So now in Arizona, we're seeing farms of solar panels for industrial solar projects, but we're also seeing housetops all throughout my neighborhood and all across the greater Phoenix area with solar showing up on top. Now, some of this has to do with government programs and local power system programs to promote solar energy. But I think it also has to do with that greater consciousness that I talk about, getting it into the consciousness of the people to move in that direction. So I have solar on my roof. I don't have batteries. I don't think the batteries they're at the stage where they will really help me as I work. But I do look forward to that at some point. So what I've elected to do is to connect to the grid. And during the day when I produce more electricity than I use, I sell that back to the grid. And we have a power-hungry state of California next door, and my local power company can sell that, reduces my rates, and I'm doing good at the same time. So I'm committed to a hybrid approach, public, private, business, and driving positive incentives to have people move forward. So this is just one example of how we can move towards this net zero challenge by 2050, taking these small steps, people being involved, and getting other people involved that we need at the ballot box or into businesses to drive these forward. So that's a current example, if you will.
Thank you. Mr. Laurent.
So I think that governments definitely need to take more action. So, well, in my country of Canada, we have a carbon tax. I think a carbon tax would work well pretty much everywhere. So there's either like a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. So there's two different options. But I think we need to do, governments need to do that. Also, it's important that we have more awareness. So there's a lot of people who are now aware of the issue of climate change as a whole. So there are people who don't believe in climate change. And there's also people who just know very little about it. So we need to have much more awareness. So governments could make education of climate change in schools, like elementary and high schools. So that's one thing that governments can do. But I think governments also need to stop subsidies to fossil fuel infrastructure and give subsidies to renewable energy. And also governments could also invest in research for new technologies or to improve current technologies. So there's a lot of things we can do. On my website, Climate Change Guide, I have an article about a podcast in which the climate scientist Michael Mann was talking. And basically, Michael Mann has a new book called The New Climate War. And basically, one thing he said is that in the past, climate change deniers would usually just deny the basic science of climate change. But now they're trying new tactics where they're saying climate change is real, but it's too late to take action, or they say or we can't do enough to take action. And so it's important for people to become aware of this, that climate change deniers are changing their tactics. And so they're using different methods. They're also using deflection, discrediting, and division. So they try to create division between environmentalists, try to discredit famous environmentalists like Al Gore or DiCaprio and so on. And there's also deflection, where some climate change deniers will say, let's not think about how the government should take action. Let's just focus on the individual level. Now, it's true that the individual level definitely has an impact, but we can't ignore the government actions. And some climate change deniers want us to just focus on the individual level. So they don't want us to focus on carbon tax, subsidies, and so on. They just want us to focus on like changing our light bulbs and that sort of thing. So once again, it's true that on an individual basis we can have a big impact, but we should definitely not forget like the government level, because the government level you can have like really massive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's important to be aware of these things. And yeah, there's more information on my website, Climate Change Guide. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David Wood, when you're discussing about that we need to create some pressure to the governments, as well as like we need to do some work together, like corporation, small medium enterprise, or youth communities for developing more strong ecosystem for climate change and other things. On the other hand, we are observing in practical world for different kind of projects, they have strong lobby, and this lobby actually influence government to do like coal related projects or oil and gas, which is actually not helpful for climate change. Even though like this lobby actually developing policy for them in that situations, actually how we can secure ourselves, even though we know that climate change will be the most challenging things after this COVID. So how the intellectual global community work together to implement this kind of policy and procedures, and create some pressure to government, that government also implement good policy. Yes.
So first thing is to expose that lobby, to draw more attention to what's actually being done by forces that are very determined to keep the status quo the status quo. These are people who think they are doing very well in the current setup. They are earning lots of revenues from the current fossil fuel mechanisms, and they don't want that to change anytime soon. And they are being very creative in all kinds of ways at disrupting initiatives to put regulations in place. So let's expose that. And the book that Laurent mentioned, Michael Mann's book on the new climate war, does great work there. It does expose how climate deniers are changing their tack, and they are finding other more subtle ways, sneakier ways to take the direction away from climate reform. But there's another thing that needs to happen as well. It's not just that we need to draw attention to the bad things that happen. We need to give people a more credible vision of a positive future. If people just think, well, the only way we can come through here is somehow by making lots of personal sacrifices, not traveling anything like so much, maybe not having children, maybe giving up on eating meat, then maybe people might know intellectually, perhaps they should go that way, but they're not going to be very excited about it. I don't think that's the right forward vision at all. I do believe we can look forward to a world of huge amounts of clean, renewable energy. We can look forward to a world of an abundance of all kinds of good things, a sustainable abundance of all kinds of good things. And once that vision is more clearly understood, that will trigger a more vigorous, positive coalition, rather than what happens just now, which is that people are very much in many minds as to how to go forwards. The climate change the movement that's trying to solve climate change is by no means unified. And there are some who are emphasizing these personal sacrifices, and there are other kinds of divisions in that community as well. So let's build a positive coalition around a credible, sustainable abundance vision, which I think needs to be clarified to everybody. And the measures that others are talking about are certainly important. The measures that Alex mentioned are extremely important to avoid unnecessary waste of energy, to improve the insulation, and to make sure heat is not get lost. Great things can be done there. But there's more in terms of capturing more energy from the sun, capturing probably energy from safe nuclear, and allowing it to enable a much richer, sustainable, deep, profound life.
Thank you. Mr. Alex.
Yes, I'm learning a lot from everyone in this discussion, and I like what's been said so far. So as far as Laura was mentioning us taking individual action. There's so many things that we could do. I mean, I made a list of all the things that I've done over the last 10 or 15 years, and it was a really long list. Of course, there's switching out light bulbs, but we all need to do more. Every single day, there's different ways that we can lower our individual waste. I mean, not even just recycling. I mean, everywhere we go, everything that we do, how we spend our time completely dictates the future. And there's so many of us making the wrong decisions every day. This is why I think it's so important that we vote with our money every day. And at the same time, Lauren mentioned the government, and I mean, you could base it off a percentage, or you can say they're equally as important. Maybe some countries' government's more important than individual action, or versa versa. But I'm a strong promoter of doing both of those and adapting, individually as fast as possible, but also implementing government rules and regulations, cap and trade. If you think, like, if there wasn't a littering law here in California, everybody would be littering everywhere all the time, as bad as I've seen it in Ghana and other places around the world. If there wasn't smog regulations, there would be a lot of vehicles polluting all over these city streets, as bad as I saw it in Nepal. If there like VOCs here in California, part of one of the LEED certifications is having zero VOCs or low VOCs in your paint, your lacquers, and a lot of the chemical products that you're using in a home or a new or existing home construction project. So VOC stands for volatile organic compound. So in California, we have some of the strictest VOC regulations. From what I remember, looking on the list, as every other state in the United States, and that had to do with like who we voted into office. And as I think it was Arnold mentioned, we cannot continue to vote politicians into office that don't believe in science, that don't believe in climate change. And government, the reason why it's so important to get someone into office, for instance, that believes in climate change or that's going to address some of these issues, is because when they enact a new law, when they put something into place, it just causes like immediate and widespread change very quickly. So instead of the people saying, oh, like, I want to get to like switching out the light bulb, or I'm always thinking about recycling, I mean, it just creates a lot of change really fast. So and what government does is it kind of even if our society is really slow to adapting, government law usually just puts everything into place right away, so it gets us caught up to where we should be. Because right now we are really, really, really far behind, and we have so much to lose. Unfortunately, in my opinion, from studying disaster relief over 2 decades, going to a lot of countries after disasters, studying climate change, we're going to continue to see a lot more suffering, and it's unfortunate that it's taken our civilization so long to adapt to this crisis. So I I don't want to go into it too much, but I did just write down a quick list from what I remembered really fast about LEED certifications. David Wood just mentioned insulation. So it's the insulation in the walls, in the ceiling, but it's also, if you want to make your home efficient, it's the doors and the cracks, where the door closes and the window closes and stuff like that. That's one way. Wasted materials, how much wasted materials is something I think LEED certification looks at. That's why I'm a huge supporter of the 3D printed homes, because they're not wasting extra insulation, sheetrock, 2x4s, 4x4s, 4x6s, sheets of plywood. They're printing what they need. So I think that's really cool with 3D homes. LEED certifications are looking for, we're looking at and analyzing and rating zero VOC paints or non-toxic paints, or just like paints that don't have any chemicals, regarding the new or existing home construction projects. They do, get higher point ratings with LEED certifications if the home is incorporating renewable energy. That could be geothermal, wind energy, but most of the time that's solar energy. They are looking if the home's made from sustainable sourced materials or recycled materials. And I did mention Energy Star appliances incorporated into the project. So one of the reasons why this is so this was kind of mentioned earlier in the conversation. With the seat belts, yeah. So as David Shoemaker, did I say that right? Yes, was talking about seatbelts in vehicles and how they started promoting the benefits of seatbelts, or just like how they were cool or how they save lives or however they promoted it, kind of like a form of activism or enticement. That's exactly what they're doing with LEED certifications. They're since we're having this global shift towards environmental consciousness, and so many people now want to lower their individual carbon footprint just to help make the world a better place and feel better about everything. Since so many companies and corporations are getting bad PR from being so polluting, and they want to go into like good PR, like Apple. I think Apple, the new building that they created right here, 30 miles from where I'm at in Silicon Valley, I think the Apple building, they were trying to do it LEED certified. There's a lot of, I wish I had a list. There's so many of the major corporations and companies that are trying to move towards LEED certified buildings. So it just makes them look good, because they might or probably are doing a lot of other bad things, because it's hard to have there's so many companies that are just wasting so much resources and energy and materials. I mean, when you go to the grocery store, look at all this excessive plastic packaging techniques all of these companies are using just to sell us products. And look at how many products just last a few weeks or a few months before they break and end up in a landfill. So, of course, we do need to continue to support the good companies that are making good quality products, sustainable products, producing organic food. But at the same time, if a bad company has to move into a LEED certified building to help them make themselves look better, I mean, I guess I'm all for it. On a different subject, I wanted to mention, I think Costa Rica is one of the countries that is close or closer to, or a few years ago they passed like zero carbon emissions or net zero, and it probably has to do with their like building to tree ratio. There's a lot of trees in Costa Rica that helps with not just producing oxygen, but with greenhouse gas emission carbon sequestration. So Costa Rica is doing really great. They also, do a lot of really cool environmental things. There's some wonderful videos on Costa Rica and all the things that they're trying to do. So one last thing that I wanted to mention that David Wood mentioned. So there's different aspects of looking at it. He was saying like, yeah, the climate, so the environmental shift towards sustainability, global sustainability, it doesn't have to be all negative and doom and gloom, or we got to do this now and that. He mentioned that there's going to be a lot of benefits. I mean, yeah, like we all just want to have like we should all want to have less pollution and more sustainable products and live sustainably and have good working conditions for the men and women and not exploit child labor. And there's all these good things that we can do that would help people, animals, and the environment simultaneously, just to help make our world a better place and be sustainable. There's a lot of things that we have to look forward to. I mean, when we have cap and trade and then the other system, it's not just about greenhouse gases and correlation with anthropogenic global warming and climate change. I mean, we all just want to breathe clean air. I mean, there's so many benefits to the things that we're doing, and it's really important that we continue this shift. But I don't necessarily want to disagree with David Wood that there's not a lot of fortunate things to look forward to, but a lot of this is not going to be fun. It's not going to be easy. Imagine giving a kid candy, their whole life, and then they're obese and overweight, and you got to take that candy away. That kid is not going to have a good day. If you go to like someone in a bar, the bartender keeps giving them drinks and drinks, and eventually the person's having such a great time, they're wasted drunk. Then you got to take away the alcohol. So our whole civilization is that obese child or that drunk person at the bar. We have been so privileged to all of these resources, just cutting down trees beyond their ability to regrow, mining stuff, just harvesting resources, killing animals, overfishing the ocean. We have done so much horrible things to the planet and to animals. It's just this is a nightmare, and we have to adapt fast. And regardless if it's going to be fun and easy or treacherous, dangerous, and horrible, like, we have to do everything that we can as fast as we can, because the bottom line is we're not living sustainable, and we have to get to a sustainable point in our society. Otherwise the nightmare is going to continue, and it's going to be irreversible.
Thank you, Mr. Alex. Thank you, Mr. Alex. Mr. David Schumacher, yes.
So as I've been sitting here absorbing all of this, I realize that climate change, just like predicting a future pandemic, are both invisible. People don't see them. Matter of fact, even when you're in the middle of climate change and when you're in the middle of a pandemic, there are those that cannot see it going on around them. And that goes back to the whole awareness capability, or the whole awareness discussion that we had. Now, I have noticed a couple of things about this pandemic that we're in, and maybe how it relates to climate change, and maybe we can use a little bit of that. When the pandemic started, many areas, like the area that I was in, went into lockdowns. It was a sudden change from how people went about doing things, and restricted their ability to go out and do things against this invisible force, this COVID-19 pandemic. That was really hard for some people, and it was definitely sacrifice for everybody. There was hope of a vaccine or vaccines being developed. That hope helped. But really, when the vaccines became available, and they are starting to be readily available in various areas, I've had, I'm fully vaccinated, for example, and so is Susan. And as I relate to other family members, I see that there is hope. It's different than the sacrifice. They did sacrifice for those that really took the lockdowns seriously. They took the sacrifice and they did what they could do, but it was very hard. And there are studies that show that psychologically there was impact for doing that, the way the human animal works. But I'm also seeing hope in the vaccines, hope of getting back to a more quote unquote normal life, but also the hope of, gee, I'm doing something. I'm contributing to something. I'm fighting this invisible enemy, and I can make it better. And I think there's some overtones there for climate change that are the same way. When we ask people to sacrifice, good people will sacrifice. peer pressure will create more people providing sacrifice, but that sacrifice can be hard to sustain, I believe. But when you offer them hope and you say, here's something that you can do positively to move forward, I think it's good for mental health. I think it's good for community health. I think it's good for the world health. And I look at those parallels between the pandemic that we're in and, if you want to call it, a similar situation for climate change because of the parallels. Let's look at what we can do to drive the hope aspect, not necessarily disregarding entirely the sacrifice aspect. That still needs to be there as well. But I think we need to offer hope to balance this, to keep people and myself for looking forward. It goes back to freedom and finances. Those are two things that are very big in American politics and extremely big in Arizona politics. And if I campaign or if I try to talk to lawmakers or potential lawmakers about sacrifice, that doesn't sell well to their constituencies and to people that they want to vote for them. But if I can talk to them about positive means to be able to move forward that impact both freedom and finances, that's something that they can sell in a political campaign. It's politically viable and it improves the future at the same time. People can get involved with that, and it goes back to being able to do something individually and collectively about improving the situation. So it's good for putting the right kind of people in office, and it's good for raising public awareness. But we need to keep the rational discussions of climate change or whatever we're working on. Today's topic is climate change out in front. And I believe that we need something like the net zero challenge, where it says we want to be net zero by 2050. We have a specific thing we want, and we have a specific time when we want it, 2050 or sooner. And by doing that, that allows that to be measurable. And as we sell people on the hopeful aspects of what they can do, we can show them how they're improving from year to year, or maybe not making as much improvement as we want. And we have data that we can use to help drive the hopeful message forward. And I want to talk just as a reminder again about Plan B, that we need to keep the idea of a Plan B out there as well. We want to hopefully move to a better future, to move towards a carbon neutral future. And if we don't, there are other things that we need to do as well, because I think having the Plan B there, just like my cryonics Plan B that I talked about earlier, if my cryonics Plan B was to work, this is a model of a doer. It is a place where I would end up waiting for resuscitation at some point in the future if I cannot keep my longevity goals alive and myself alive along with it. That's not where I want to be. That becomes a motivator as well to go ahead and move forward with Plan A and to make sure that Plan A is getting sufficient resources and attention and enthusiasm. So that needs to be turned into reasonable short-term goals. 2050 is a long-term goal. Me moving into triple digits of longevity is a long-term goal. But if I go back to that piece of candy, if I go back to that extravagant lifestyle that will have negative impacts on what I want my long-term goal to be, I can adjust my short-term goals and I can compare them with the data of how I'm doing from day to day, year to year. So there's definitely some parallels there too. So it's a matter of keeping awareness, it's a matter of keeping focus, and it's a matter of maintaining the conversation. And that's why I'm glad that we're all here today, furthering that conversation too.
Thank you. Mr. Lauren.
So there are many big companies that are planning to go 100% renewable. So these include big companies such as Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, eBay, and so on. So it is important for not only the government to take action, but for companies themselves, transnational companies to take action, and that's already starting to happen. So that's good news. I think as the public needs to pressure governments to take action, they need to pressure companies to take action, and they also have to take individual action. So I think we have to in order to get net zero carbon emissions, we have to like fight the problem at many different aspects, many different levels. Uh, as I said before, I think it's very important that we have a carbon tax. So in my country, Canada, we established a carbon tax recently. I think a carbon tax could have a huge impact because it gives us very strong market incentive to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Now, in the case of Canada, what happens is that the money raised from the carbon tax actually goes back to the people, to the consumers. So there's a lot of people who are spreading misinformation saying that a carbon tax will make things more expensive for the average consumer, or a carbon tax will hurt the economy. In reality, the carbon tax could be given back to the people to spend back on the economy. So usually people who are afraid of a carbon tax are the big polluters, but in reality, carbon tax could actually help society a lot, not just in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also like helping the middle class and the working class. Uh, Oh yeah, on my website Climate Change Guide, I have like a list of documentaries that I recommend. There's a documentary I saw recently. It's an old documentary from 2003 called The Corporation, and the corporation talks about many different aspects of a corporation, but it also talks about the environmental impacts of a corporation and how we need to like get them to be more sustainable. Uh, so yeah, I recommend that particular documentary. There's also another documentary that I recommended when I was on the show before. I talked about Merchants of Doubt, and David Shoemaker was talking about how car companies shifted to get like seat belts and airbags and so on. If I remember correctly, in the documentary Merchants of Doubt, they said that the car companies were fighting against seat belts in the beginning. They didn't want to do this. Similarly, cigarette companies didn't want laws to restrict smoking. And then now we have the fossil fuel companies who are trying to go against carbon tax and against many different environmental regulations. But it's important for people to like push companies to do the right thing. And more specifically, we need to get the governments to take action. We need to create laws. Now, in terms of electric cars, there are some countries already that are trying to phase out gasoline cars. So some countries, if I'm not mistaken, by the year 2035 or 2040, they want to completely phase out gasoline cars. That's a very important measure. So even though we can do a lot in individual action, we need to do a lot to make governments take action. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you for today's sessions. Actually, we get a lot of information regarding climate change, especially net zero challenge, and we find we have to develop our ecosystem with modern science and engineering. Beside that, we need to develop our policy, how as well as we need to develop our entrepreneurial ecosystems, and this is the way actually World Talent Economy Forum, not only this kind of roundtable discussion, we also want to take initiative inside the ecosystem of Asia Pacific and the Asia. So definitely the speakers, the panelists, those who give us the guideline, based on their guideline, we will implement in the real life. This is our objectives. So I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. I want to start from Mr. David Wood, then Mr. Alex, then Mr. Laurent, and finally Mr. David Schumacher.
So I've got two concluding remarks. I want to talk about Plan B, which I think is an important discussion. And I also want to talk about the actual goal that we should have in mind, whether carbon neutral, zero, is the appropriate goal. So in terms of Plan B, I think that's entirely right. We should be responsible and be prepared to consider a much wider range of solutions than the ones we had initially at mind. And so, I mean, nuclear energy comes into this. You know, some climate campaigners don't like nuclear energy for various reasons, but it turns out that there's a variety of different nuclear options, including fusion. which I wouldn't rule out. Even though nuclear fusion has been 20 years away in the future, ever since the first person who said that in the 1950s, at one of the first conferences about nuclear fusion, I think it could be less than 20 years away now. Why? Because of artificial intelligence, because of some very interesting new small reactor designs that use high temperature superconductors, which weren't feasible in the past. So that is not so far away as before. So that's one type of plan B. It's different energy sources. But then there is, as David Schumacher pointed out, the possibilities of geoengineering. And that is also on a spectrum. Some of it is probably safer than others in the sense that we understand it more. So planting more trees is a kind of geoengineering because the trees suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Synthetic trees or artificial trees sound horrible, but in some cases they actually may be better than normal trees at removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And there could be many other initiatives. So I think Elon Musk has recently announced a competition to look at novel ways in which that might work. I'm more nervous about the other kinds of geoengineering proposals that put lots of particles high in the stratosphere. That might indeed reduce the temperature in some parts of the world, but whenever this has happened historically, as there's been large volcanoes, such as the most recent one is Mount Pino, I mean, I've got the name of that wrong, about 30 years ago, it did bring down the global temperature, but it also caused lots of floods and droughts. And it seems that kind of a geoengineering intervention might also have many drawbacks as well as many plus points. But we shouldn't rule it out, and we should definitely be putting some of our collective brain power onto these topics. Then my comment on what the right goal should be. I don't think net zero is enough, and I don't think 2050 is soon enough. Even if there was net zero additional emissions of carbon, we've got already too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is causing the temperature of the Earth to keep rising, even if we no longer add to that by emitting more. So we do need to find ways to actually withdraw some of that CO2, probably. So we do need some kinds of maybe low-risk geoengineering mechanisms. But in any case, I think there is a worry that we might reach one of the tipping points I mentioned in my first interventions, possibly sooner than we want. So I would argue in favor of reaching net zero by 2035 in at least some countries. I'm not sure that Costa Rica is there yet. I was Googling frantically in the background after that was suggested. There seems to be some conflicting information online as to whether they are there yet. Probably not. Some countries can get there sooner than others. So I think the United Kingdom, the United States, most countries in the EU can aim at 2035. That's more ambitious, but if we are truly serious, we should bring it down as quickly as possible because there are about 9 possible tipping points that might plunge the climate and the environment into very bad behavior at any time. And although it's a small probability that it's going to happen in any one year, we can't rule it out. So I think we need to be more ambitious, and we need to raise a clarion call louder, and we need to continue on exactly the kind of education that this discussion is doing now. So thanks very much to you, Sharif, for organizing it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forums. And definitely we want to do more session with you and your organizations. Mr. Alex.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to say thank you, David Shoemaker, for bringing up the pandemic and the correlation and how we responded. There are a lot of correlations to the climate emergency that we're in and the pandemic. We learned a lot from this pandemic that we could implement and apply to climate-related solutions. I'm thankful that I did get my first vaccine a few days ago, and towards the beginning, I was a huge promoter of, the sheltering in place, the lockdowns, wearing face masks, doing whatever we can or whatever we could at that time with the information we had. And with whatever information we had, we were trying our best, all of us, our society, to make the best decisions to potentially save lives. And we knew it wasn't it was sacrifices that we made for the long-term goals of, a lot of people could have died. I mean, I went to Ghana during the peak of the Ebola outbreak. That was killing people at like a 50% rate. I mean, like 700 doctors, or maybe it was like 400, 500. A lot of doctors, nurses, EMTs, people trying to solve that died, and people still said it wasn't real, and it was starting to jump to other countries. Thankfully, we are getting a grasp on this pandemic, and we've taken action quickly. And David Shoemaker mentioned sacrifice, and that was important to help save lives during the pandemic. That is going to be important in addressing the climate emergency that we're in. So not only do we need a lot of people taking small actions, we need, other people taking more actions. And unfortunately, the people that went into lockdown and stayed in lockdown and they did really good, they made up for the people that weren't doing lockdowns at all. And that's kind of how this climate emergency goes. I mean, a lot of people are making small actions, but some people have to make huge sacrifices, maybe not to have a kid, maybe to go vegan if they really don't want to, not to drive a car for a really long time, just to make up for the others that aren't. And this goes for countries as well. Some countries are making incredible sacrifices where other countries are not. Some countries are transitioning from a developing country to a developed country. They're starting to want that, middle class lifestyle. They're wanting to own their own car and consume more resources. So we all have to do more to lower our carbon footprint and our environmental impact. As far as Plan B was mentioned, there's all these memes and information, there's no Planet B. We are getting to the point where there's almost a Planet B, or could be. I mean, I'm not saying that we're going to have enough time to inhabit Mars or be an interplanetary species, but I do think that is giving hope to a lot of the millionaires and the billionaires to just hold off on, the environmental destruction here on Earth, and until they have enough time to make it to Mars. I don't necessarily agree with going to Mars, but maybe it is giving people hope, and that's a whole nother aspect. I do know that if we cannot stop the climate emergency that we're in and those 9 feedback loops that were taking place, we have so much nuclear radiation around the world, so many chemicals, and so much pollution. I mean, just when 13,000 houses burned here in California. Correct me if I'm wrong with that number. That pollution affected all of California and a large percentage of the West Coast. Imagine if we can't get a grip on this climate emergency and cities start catching fire. I mean, the pollution is going to spread around the world. We already can't take care of the nuclear waste that we have stored in different locations around the world. If you get on Google and type in nuclear waste, it's horrifying. I mean, there's nuclear waste leaking all over the world. So, and the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because if you're a billionaire trying to build an underground bunker, or a millionaire trying to build $1 million bunker, I don't think those options are sustainable. We all have to work together to save this planet and, re-terraform Earth, to a habitable planet. Otherwise, so anyways, that's my perspective on that. Even though David Wood, I've only been on a few shows with him. Maybe this is the second one. He's a really nice guy. I disagree with nuclear. Lawrence also, pro-nuclear. I don't think we have the capability to deal with the radiation and the waste, and I don't feel comfortable putting that on the future generations of the world. I do realize that the benefits of it, and I do know a little bit about the fusion reactor, and we're getting closer to that working, and it doesn't create all of the radiation and the harmful byproducts of nuclear. Unfortunately, when we transition towards everyone driving electric vehicles, that's going to increase the electrical needs of our planet. But if we had an abundance or unlimited surplus of energy, the planet and our civilization is still a heat engine. It's still heating up the planet. So no, if we continue to create free energy, it still causes heat. We're still heating our home. We open the door, whatever we're doing, it still goes back out into the atmosphere. And if we are going to go those directions, we need to implement more forms of carbon sequestration, carbon capture, cap and trade, and planting more trees and all of that, composting, and we're gonna just so we can stay in balance with those aspects. Laurent did mention the cap and trade, and that has a really bad name for some reason. There's some like a lot of misinformation and disinformation, like Laurent always mentions. People just don't like cap and trade. I don't know much about cap and trade other than you say it and all these people attack you all the time. I do know that I have sat down multiple times, probably 3 or 4 hours total, with the congressional aide of Jimmy Panetta. He's one of the 22nd congressional whatever in the House. Okay, okay. So anyways, I sit down all the time with Emmanuel. He's a congressional aide of Jimmy Panetta, and he talks to me about solutions he's working on. And there's something else that Jimmy Panetta is trying to do that's way better than cap and trade. I don't know what it is, but it's like super cool, and he's excited about it. And it's like a better system. And cap and trade is where they trade credits, and it still gets consumed, and it's a bad system, I think. So I think there's a better system they're working on that I hope they continue to implement. And then I wanted to say, David, that's cool that you don't have the batteries with your solar system. I think that's a good option not to have the batteries. They're good for some areas, but if you are grid tied back into the system and you can give your electricity back into the system, then you don't have the batteries that only last, 5, 10, even if they last 15 years, then they're not going back into the landfills or polluting the environment. So that's really cool. California is setting the stage in a lot of aspects, and that's not just with the zero VOCs and the smog regulations I mentioned earlier. They are setting the stage that Gavin Newsom, I know a lot of people hate him. I don't know much about him, but I do know that he's trying to get all the vehicles electric in California by what is that, 2030, 2040? I don't know. I don't remember the date, but he's trying to, he's doing his best to, he knows about climate change. He's trying to implement solutions, and that's a lot better than the majority of the politicians in the United States that just aren't doing anything or aren't doing enough. So, again, we got to continue to vote with our money and vote politicians into office that are trying to address climate change and this environmental crisis we're in.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks
Alex.
again for another wonderful show. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Laurent, what the concluding remarks for today? Yes.
So David Wood mentioned Elon Musk, and basically I Google search it. So he's offering $100 million prize for a new carbon capture technology, or a good carbon capture technology. One thing that I would like to say as final remarks is that there's a lot of good documentaries that people should watch to learn more about it. On my website, Climate Change Guide, I have a list of good documentaries, some directly about climate change and some that are not as direct, but still talk about environmental issues. So Alex Londo's mentioned nuclear. Okay, so basically there's a documentary on Netflix called Inside Bill's Brain, Decoding Bill Gates. And basically there's 3 episodes. First episode is about improving sanitation. Second episode is on polio vaccines. And the last episode is about TerraPower. And basically on my website, I have an article about it. And basically there's a lot of information about how a new type of power plant could actually use nuclear waste as a fuel. So the nuclear waste from the previous nuclear power plants could actually fuel the new type of nuclear power plant, and they have enough energy for more than 100 years. They have enough waste to supply over 100 years of energy. So there's a new type of nuclear power called the wave traveling power, and so there's more information about that on my website. And also just to say, in the documentary, they mentioned that in the worst case scenario, nuclear power causes less than a few thousand deaths globally, but coal plants cause at least 800,000 deaths per year. Fossil fuels cause in total is several million deaths per year from the air pollution. So nuclear power is actually very safe compared to fossil fuels, even when you look at the worst case scenarios. So I hope people are more open-minded about nuclear power, and I would recommend people watch documentaries, whether it's Merchants of Doubt, Inconvenient Truth, Inconvenient Sequel, Before the Flood, Greenwald Rising, and so on. So it's good to be more educated about environmental issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher. What's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, thank you for another great discussion on a very important topic. Rational discussions are our way forward. Varied viewpoints are our strength. I like the idea, Sharif, that you don't get people that just have a single focus to talk about, that we can come at these solutions from various angles. And I think we need to do that. We need to hear everybody that has something rational and constructive to say. All options need to be considered, and we need to make decisions based on evidence. And that will get us hopefully to the future that we want, but we'll have to make change as we analyze these potential solutions and as we examine the evidence, and evidence may change over time. So there may be many course corrections as we move forward. But how do you make big change? Big change to me is like trying to turn a huge ocean liner, if you will. The way to turn that ocean liner is to use the rudder. It's a very small part of the ship, but it will turn the whole ship. I think that rudder that we're talking about today is back to politics again, back to that awareness, back to awareness in the business area. So I advocate for the kind of future that I want. I vote for the kind of future that I want. I talk to politicians that agree with me, and I talk to politicians that disagree with me, and keep the discussion moving. Vote with your money. Vote for businesses that support the kind of future that you want. Vote by choosing products and services that are congruent with the kind of future that you want. And if you have the means to do any investing, don't invest just for profitability, but invest with the intent of supporting the kind of future that you want. So I see a very hopeful time forward. Doesn't mean that there aren't big challenges. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work to do. And it doesn't mean that there won't be some sacrifice involved. But I have the hope that we can go forward and do these things. So thank you for continuing the conversation, Sharif.
Thank you, sir, for all of your support. Because World Talent Economy Forums is for the youth community. But beside that, your continuous support, the speakers, those who always support us, guide us, give us the real strategy how we can solve different kind of problem. That is very, very helpful for us. So hopefully we will get more support from our speaker, from our audience, from around the world, and by this way we can develop a better ecosystem. Thank you for joining today's session. I want to give special thanks Mr. David Wood, Mr. David Schumacher, Mr. Alex, as well as Mr. Lawrence, and the like audience, those who always observe World Talent Economy Forums. And please share our content, share our videos, share our content in your classroom, even with your policymaker, with your government, with corporation, with even small medium enterprise, even though different kind of startup. I'm sure with our contents, they can get very good guideline from our honorable speakers, for our honorable mentors, and by this way you can solve many of your local problems. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye bye. Take
Thank you,
care.
Sharif.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.